And I've been asked to do a study session, and I want to see this as an opportunity for you to get a sense of how we think about teaching classical texts, classical Jewish texts at HUC, and what it means to really engage our tradition in ways that make it not only interesting to us as students of the past, but as future Jewish leaders. What can we do with our tradition? How can we make meaning for ourselves and for others? And I just want to introduce this. I know this is a very difficult time in Jewish history for all of us. And I want to say that what the Jewish community really needs right now is leaders, people who are both thoughtful and compassionate. And so I'm delighted to see that you're thinking about becoming rabbis. I'm really excited for you to start this journey and for HUC to be part of it. So the text that we're going to look at today, I'm going to share my screen. The text we're going to look at today is a text that I started teaching during the pandemic because it felt really important during that time to think about what it means to retreat into a space when we can't be with other people. But I think it's a good text overall to talk about what does it mean to be a Jewish leader? How do you think about the powers that be? How do you think about your own authority? And how do you think about the people that you lead? So we're going to work through this text. And I just want to background this by sharing with you three assumptions that I make when I study and when I teach rabbinic texts. This is a text from the Talmud. The first is that these texts illuminate the culture and the values of the early rabbis. Sometimes they resonate for us, and other times they don't, and that's okay. I never want my students to think that they have to like a text or they have to feel a certain way about a text. Some texts we find really inspiring. Sometimes we find texts really fun, and sometimes we're really disturbed by them. And all of those reactions to texts are completely natural and completely all right. The second is that while rabbinic texts may reveal the culture and values of the past, they can also allow us to think about present issues and present values, including rabbinic education and the role of rabbis. And finally, that when we study rabbinic texts, we're invited to hear the voice of the text and the voice of the people we're studying with, and then to add our own voice to the ongoing conversation of the Jewish people. So text study is incredibly active, and it means partnering with each other and with the text. So that's what we're going to do today. Just for a little bit of context, the star of the text is a rabbi named Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva and presumably lived sometime in the 2nd century. The setting for this text purports to be in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s of the Common Era, which led to a series of restrictions on Judaism, including a restriction on the teaching of Torah. And so it's in that context that we find 3 rabbis sitting one day and critiquing Roman government. So here's our text. We're going to do a lot of pausing. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai were sitting together. Rabbi Yehuda began saying, "How lovely are the deeds of this nation, that is, rah-rah Romans. They establish markets and build bridges and bathhouses." Rabbi Yossi was silent. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, "Everything they do for their own benefit. The markets allow them to set up houses of prostitution. The bathhouses allow them to make themselves comfortable. The bridges allow them to collect tolls." The government heard what they had said. And the Romans said, "Yehuda, who praised us, will be rewarded. Yossi, who was silent, will be exiled to Sepphoris, a city in the north. Shimon, who criticized us, shall be put to death." That's paragraph number 1. So The first question I want us to think about is what can we learn from this apparently public exchange among these three rabbis? Um, what what kind of thinking might they have done before they had this conversation in public? And what, if anything, can this story teach us about what it means to speak truth to power, and what it means to use your voice as a rabbi to attempt to critique the powers that be or to comment on the political and social movements of your day? So, anybody who'd like to unmute and make a comment, you're invited to. This is a interactive conversation. Jacob.
Hi, first of all, thank you for hosting us this afternoon. It is greatly appreciated. Um, a few questions came to mind after this short chunk. The first, noticing where it is, like, how does this relate, or if it does relate back to Shabbat? I noticed that was at the top. The second is, what is the status of these rabbis if they can have this type of conversation in such a public forum? And third is their use of together. How does it says they sat together and talked, but where does that separateness come in that they allowed, or at least from what I know right now, they allowed the fate of each individual to separate that togetherness. And I'm wondering where that stems from and how we can kind of justify that, or if we have to.
Great. So the answer to your first question, why is this in Tractate Shabbat, besides the answer that the Talmud has a tendency uh, to go off on tangents frequently, I think will become apparent at the end. I think the question that Jacob's asking is what were these rabbis thinking to critique the Roman government in public? What does that tell us about them? Now, obviously, one of the things it tells us is that the Talmud needs to set this story in a public place so that it can go on to the next part of the story. But it does suggest that they feel comfortable schmoozing in the marketplace, if you will. I mean, I love to imagine this conversation happening on a park bench, right? That they're just sort of hanging out and they're talking about how they feel about the politics of their day, and they don't seem to be considering the possibility that either that someone will overhear them and report their conversation. And I think that this is an interesting thing we all think about when we're asked to sign a petition, when we're asked to express our opinion, and we think to ourselves, oh, I'm just telling Jacob how I feel. And the next thing we discover is that we're on Instagram, right? Or that petition that we thought was just sharing around our colleagues turns out to be published in the New York Times. So those are the kinds of questions I think are really important for us to ask, is when we decide to speak, when we decide to amplify our voice as rabbis, what are the considerations that we might want to take first? Any other thoughts? And Alex says in the chat that the implication is that the rabbi's words have power, right? That the mere fact that the Romans respond the way they do suggests that they care about what the rabbis are saying. And I think that's a really important point, that words have power precisely because other people care about them, and the voices of rabbis have power for that same reason. Otherwise, I wouldn't get 8 calls in the last week asking me to sign a letter, because I don't feel like if I don't put rabbi in front of my name, I don't think anyone outside knows me, or at least I hope not. Let's go back to the text. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is now under a sentence of death. So what does he do? Rabbi Shimon and his son went and hid in the house of study. They go to their happy place. All right. Every day, his wife brought them food and water. After the decree went into force, he said to his son, "Forgive me, women are weak. Perhaps they will harass her, and she will reveal our hiding place." So they went and they hid in a cave. A miracle occurred. A carob tree and a spring were created for them. They cast off their clothes and sat in the sand up to their necks and studied all day. When it was time for prayer, they dressed, covered their heads, and prayed. Then they removed their clothes again so they wouldn't wear out. So, very similar to the pandemic, Rabbi Shimon and his son find themselves in mandated isolation for a significant period of time. And they make certain choices about the allocation of resources and about what they have the opportunity to do in in quarantine, if you will, in isolation. And I'm interested what you think about their choices. What can we say about the choice to hide in a cave as opposed to, let's say, running away to Syria or someplace and studying Torah and eating a lot of carob?
So it seems like the they almost assume that God will provide for them. All of these choices are made with the understanding that that if they hide in the cave and keep praying and studying Torah, then God will create the carob tree and the spring. So it seems to me to be suggesting that God will almost reward those who speak truth to power.
Ah, okay. So it is clear that this is only possible because a miracle occurs, right? Otherwise, you couldn't stay in a cave a long time. Um, so yes, they're definitely relying on divine support, divine protection, and one might argue from that God approves of Rabbi Shimon speaking truth to power. I guess we could also imagine that God approves of their choice of use of time, right? That God is protecting Rabbi Shimon not necessarily because he spoke truth to power, although I'm sure the rabbis believed that God held their same views about the Romans, but that the fact that they've decided to dedicate themselves to the study of Torah in a cave is something that's divinely approved. Anybody else? So they stayed in the cave for 12 years. 12 years, by the way, seems to be 12 is a very big number. I just had it 5 times in a passage I taught yesterday. Then Elijah, as in Elijah the prophet, came and stood at the mouth of the cave and said, "Who will tell Bar Yochai, Rabbi Shimon, that Caesar has died and his decree is annulled?" They left the cave and they saw people plowing and sowing. He, that is Rabbi Shimon, said, "They abandon life eternal and focus on temporal things." Every place he cast his eyes immediately went up in flames. A heavenly voice went forth and said, "Did you leave the cave to destroy my world? Go back into your cave." So Elijah often shows up in rabbinic stories when we need a divine messenger. We need someone to sort of drop a hint that something's changed outside that they haven't noticed. So after 12 years, Elijah stands outside the cave and says, I wonder if the people in the cave know that the emperor has died, and with him, his decrees are annulled. So, in response to this, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son leave the cave, What do they see when they leave the cave? What's happening out in the world that they have been ignoring for 12 years? Harish?
People are going about their lives.
Yes, people are going about their normal lives, probably what they've been doing for 12 years. That is, what these people are doing is what people do, right? They're living in an agricultural society, and people are plowing and sowing because if they don't plow and sow, they'll starve to death. They don't have magical carob trees out there outside the cave. So presumably they see exactly what they saw before they went into the cave, assuming they were paying any attention to the world around them, except they, they react in the most amazing way. Imagine that you go for a walk in the country. You're walking in the country, it's fall, you decide to go pumpkin patch picking or apple picking, or you go out to see the leaves changing, unless you live in California when that doesn't happen. And you see people doing what people do. You see people going to the grocery store. You see people plowing their fields. What's your reaction normally? Yeah, nothing. Right? I mean, you might say, oh, look, there's somebody weeding their potato patch. But you usually do not go into raptures about this, and nor do you become really angry. But Rabbi Shimon is furious. And he's furious because he says to his son, they abandon life eternal and focus on temporal things. So he's setting up a dichotomy. What does he do? What does he think he and his son have been focusing on for 12 years? The temporal or the eternal?
The eternal, on God.
Yes, they have been doing God's work. They are sitting and studying Torah. And that, he believes, is really admirable. All of these other people out there, it's as if they don't know what really matters. They are just, I don't know, out there trying to survive every day. And he is so angry that his anger becomes a physical manifestation. I don't know. The first and only frightening movie I ever saw was Carrie. Right? And that's what this reminds me of. I still have nightmares. Okay. Um, yes, Alex makes a really good point. How are they supposed to know what the right thing is to do? He clearly isn't helping, right? Yes, he has forgotten what rabbis are supposed to do. But the point is, his anger, which we think of as an internal emotion, becomes an externally focused, destructive force. And we hear a heavenly voice, which is presumably attributed to some extension of God. And God, who Shimon, I think, thinks he's personally defending, says, what are you doing? Did you come out of your cave so you could destroy my world? That is God. God apparently thinks that this is part of God's creation and God's plan, that there are going to be people who are going to be planting and sowing, and that's completely okay. So it's as if you let somebody out of their room and they immediately start to break everything. And so God says, back in the cave. So here, God is actually the if you will, the figure that understands what's going on, and Rabbi Shimon is not. Okay, so back into the cave. They went back into the cave and stayed there for 12 months, saying the judgment of the wicked in Gehenna is 12 months. That is, they treat themselves like people who have done something terribly wrong. A heavenly voice went forth and said, leave your cave after 12 months. They went out. Whenever Rabbi Elazar, that's the son, was harsh, when he looked around and was critical about the world outside the cave, his father, Rabbi Shimon, was conciliatory. He said to him, "My son, it is enough for the world that you and I study Torah." On the eve of Shabbat, which answers your question, Jacob, toward nightfall, they saw an elderly man carrying 2 bunches of myrtle and running. They said to him, "What are you doing with those?" He said to them, "Honoring Shabbat. I bought flowers to honor Shabbat." "Wouldn't one be enough?" they asked. And he responds, "One is for remember and the other for observe." If you look at the 2 versions of the 10 Commandments, one in Exodus, one in Deuteronomy, one of them begins Zachor at Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath, and the other begins Kabed at Yom Shamor at Yom HaShabbat, right? So the rabbis ask, why are there 2 different verbs? And they say, one to tell us to remember Shabbat, one to tell us to honor Shabbat. So that's what this man says. And Rabbi Shimon says to his son, "How dear are the commandments to Israel," and he was calm. So what does Rabbi Shimon learn, apparently, from his second period of isolation in the cave? Clearly, in the first 12 years in the cave, what I assume he learned was a lot of Torah and a lot of impatience. What does he learn in these 12 months?
I think he learned people follow the Torah in their own ways.
That's clearly what he learns eventually. But even before he sees the old man, what does he learn in the sense that his son is still uptight, and yet Rabbi Shimon is now conciliatory and says, "Look, we're studying Torah. That's enough, right? Don't be angry at these people who aren't studying Torah." What has he learned?
That everyone has their own path as a Jew.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly he's learned that not everyone does the same thing, and that not everyone is going to sit still for any long period of time, much less 12 years, and study Torah. And that he's, if you will, he's become aware of the reality of the world, is how to put it most simply. He now understands that not everybody has exactly the same values as he does, or not everybody acts those values out the same way he does. Yes, Alex, he learns patience, and he learns to be more compassionate towards people who are not quite like him. And then from the old man, he learns something even sort of more nuanced, if you will, as Harish says. He's learned that not everyone does Judaism the same way. And yet, that doesn't mean they don't care about Judaism. That is, maybe this old man doesn't know as much as Rabbi Shimon. Maybe he doesn't study as much as Rabbi Shimon, but he understands the importance of Shabbat. I don't even know what else he does on Shabbat, but the mere fact that he brings home flowers is a really good start. And I'm sure that everyone at home would have felt that way too. So Rabbi Shimon is definitely learning. Why didn't he learn that the first time? Why? I mean, I think about, if you go back to think about that period of time you spent locked up during the pandemic, some of which I know some of us spent really like I went out and took a walk every day, crossing the street every time I saw other human beings, and that was it. Otherwise, home all the time. Why did Rabbi Shimon not go out of the cave in the first place and say, "Wow, the sun is shining. I am so lucky not to have to be in this blasted cave any longer. I was sick of Caribs, right? I really want to go and get a beer. And studying Torah for 12 years is really, a little tedious." Why didn't he get it the first time?
I
Lauren.
think the lack of exposure makes us myopic. That there's this expression of we have to be able to relate with and see outside of, that the cave narrows us. And just that little bit of time, being able to come back in just the 12 months, a 12th of the initial experience, there's already been a softening and a release of the judgment.
I think Lauren and Alex, who put this in the chat, both are suggesting that, ironically, or perhaps understandably, that when we find ourselves in a small space for an extended period of time, while you could imagine thinking, I can't wait to get out into the bigger space, what actually happens is your sort of view of life narrows, right? I mean, when all you can think about, besides, am I going to go to the grocery store and am I going to get home and not get COVID? All right, is the cave, right? The cave becomes really narrow. I think this comes out in Plato too, but I don't remember my Plato as well as I remember my Talmud, right? And so Rabbi Shimon, in a sense, becomes myopic, becomes narrowly focused, having such a small venue, such a small set of things to look at and to interact with, that he doesn't know anymore how to be in the world. Whereas the second time, perhaps because it's a shorter period of time, or perhaps because of God's tochecha, God's rebuke of him, he goes into the cave not just to hide, not just to study Torah, but to actually contemplate why God is angry at him, why God has sent him into the cave. And I want to think about how we react to Rabbi Simon's closing comment, or not so closing, but when he says to his son, it's enough for the world that you and I study Torah. What is he acknowledging about the world, about his role in it, about what people do?
That's his place, his job, his focus, and not necessarily everyone's.
That we're not all going to come into Judaism the same way. So I want to sort of think about why I picked this and why I think this is such a good preparation for rabbinic education, both for people who are about to encounter it and for those of us who organize it. I think that this text helps us think about 5 different things that are really important when we're thinking about leadership of the Jewish community. The first, going back to the 3 rabbis sitting and letting off steam, is to think about when we should speak and when we should remain silent. Now, for Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues, that's very much about power, right? About what it means to be under the control of what rabbis experienced as an oppressive government. I don't think that the Roman government thought it was oppressive, but it certainly probably felt that way out in the boonies, out in the land of Israel. I think that we, thank God, do not live under an oppressive government. We just live under a fascinating government. But nonetheless, I think that we all know that sometimes we speak out and it's quite effective, and other times we speak out and the response is quite startling to us and upsetting. And I think silence is the same thing, right? Sometimes being silent really makes sense, and sometimes being silent makes us feel that we're not doing what we ought to do. So I think this text reminds us that we have to really be thoughtful and intentional, both in choosing to speak and in choosing maybe not to speak. The second is, yes, the Romans were not the only ones who heard them. What's interesting is I cut this out of the story because I didn't want to get distracted. But apparently what happens is I don't think they're reported, but somebody hears them. A fellow Jew hears them and just keeps talking about it, like goes somewhere and says, oh, hey, guess what I heard these 3 rabbis say? And it says it got to the Roman government. Not that somebody spied on them, but that, as we know, when you say things to some people, often those things end up being repeated to people who you didn't intend. The second thing is a question of how to offer criticism or how to offer feedback, if you prefer. That is, what does it need to decide how you're going to deliver a message when you're criticizing whoever you're criticizing, an individual, your community, the government, another country? What does it mean to offer your view on something in a way that it can be heard? The third, I think, in terms of the cave is when to take a stand and when to retreat. That is there a time when going into a cave is actually not a bad idea? I was talking to someone today. I don't know what life is like where you are, but at the Hebrew Union College right now, I think it's fair to say almost everyone is a little freaked out. And whatever their politics, it really doesn't matter right now. Everybody is concerned, everybody is worried, everybody is feeling some sense of angst. And I said to somebody, you know, every day we sort of try to say something nice at services, or we try to take care of people, but I wonder if maybe what we just need is a day off. Like maybe we actually need a day in the cave, like, sort of, national cancel class day. That doesn't seem to be possible, but there are times when retreating into a cave is not really a bad idea. And then there are times when retreating into a cave is profoundly irresponsible. So how do you know when each of those times is? The fourth is the value of perspective. How do you step back for a moment to try to see something that you're enmeshed in? One of my colleagues teaches a leadership book that talks about the ability that part of leadership is the ability to simultaneously be on the dance floor and be in the balcony watching the dance. How do we as leaders, get into the weeds, and even as we're in the weeds, step back mentally and say, what is happening in this interaction, and how do I keep it from going someplace I don't want it to go? And most important, I think, for anyone who's going to work in the Jewish community, the value of different forms of Jewish expression. Rabbis become very, very, and rabbinical students especially, completely absorbed in thinking about Judaism in an incredibly intellectual, thick, engaged way. I joke that when I started my doctoral work at the Jewish Theological Seminary, there were no women in the rabbinical schools, so the ratio of men to women was heavily male. And as a result, if you were a single woman, you got asked out a lot. And I said to somebody, the problem with dating rabbinical students is all they talk about is Judaism. All the time. I told my husband the reason that I married him was because he talked about Jane Austen, and I was so relieved. So then you go out into the world and you suddenly discover that nobody else is thinking about that stuff. And you think, wait a minute, what's wrong? Why aren't you reading Torah all the time? Or I'm finding right now really struggling with the fact that I know Jews, like I meet Jews at my coffee place, and they're not upset about what's happening in Israel. They're not anything about what's happening in Israel. It's not that they feel great about it. It's that it's like just not on, I mean, they know it's happening, but it's just not on their radar, right? And I'm like, whoa, how can this be? So I think the end of the story reminds us that not everyone is going to be as invested in Judaism the way we are, and that we're going to have to learn to love those people and appreciate those people and interact with those people, even so, even more perhaps than we would if they shared all of our assumptions. So with that, I see we still have time. So If you have questions about rabbinical school that you would like to ask me, I know a lot about the curriculum. I know a lot about rabbinical school in general. I'd be really happy to answer them.
I was just going to take it back a quick second and say that the weak woman moment we didn't go toward. Just wanted to, didn't like that addition.
Yes, yes. So look, I think first of all that the rabbis are, it's interesting, they're the ones hiding, right? So it's hard to actually know why they think they're so tough. I think that one of the interesting things about rabbinic stories that you'll see if you study enough of them is that they're incredibly weak on detail. Like I joke sometimes. I don't know if you were if I did said this in the class you sat in on, Lauren. I joke sometimes that if the rabbis had creative writing class, their creative writing instructor would have said, take this story and round out your characters, right? Not enough detail, no description, can't imagine how this character looks. And I think that the wife is a device, if you will, to get them into the cave. It's an interesting thing that they don't start in the cave, but I think part of that is that there's a progression. There's a progression from the public square where they get in trouble, the house of study, the Beit Midrash, which is their natural place, but which at the end of the day you go home from, and the cave, which is which is the end of the line, right? The place where you're trapped. And the wife becomes the device both to explain how they survived hiding in the Beit Midrash and why they can't stay in the Beit Midrash. Um, in fairness, it's interesting, Lauren, because they could have just written something like, after the decree went into force, he said to his son, we're endangering our wife and mother because right, so let's hide somewhere else. And of course I don't see how being in the cave actually makes her any safer, but it obviously makes them safer. So yes, when we read stories about rabbis, we discover that as much as they may love their wives, they love their Torah even more. It's very frustrating.
I wanted to ask, what kind of preparation for rabbinical school, in your experience, most leads to success? Or what kind of preparation do you wish that your students had coming in?
So I would say that in terms of academic or intellectual preparation, that I would say first and foremost Hebrew, any kind of Hebrew, as much Hebrew as possible. And by the way, not because of the Hebrew entrance exam, right? I mean, although yeah, that's there. I would say that because I feel like when you're in rabbinical school, the best thing is to be able to engage the sources, and Hebrew is the key that unlocks that door. So, what I say to people is, imagine you have an hour to prepare for a Bible class, and you're going to discuss the binding of Isaac. If you have 1 hour, I'd rather you spend as little of that hour as possible with your fingers in the biblical dictionary, right? I'd rather you spend as much of that hour as possible by yourself or with your study partner saying, wow, this story is really a problem. Or what am I supposed to do with the fact that Isaac and Abraham have that strange conversation and Isaac keeps walking up the hill with his father knowing that something's wrong? So the more Hebrew you know when you come into the college, the more fun rabbinical school is, and the less drudgery. That's what. also because I happen to really be a big fan of Hebrew texts. So that's one thing. Look, I think other than that, any Jewish background you have is great. If you took a Jewish history course in college, super, you know something about the chronology of Jewish history. If you read through the Torah, even in English is a great language. Then you come in, and then when somebody says, and then there's that story about blah blah blah, you don't go, huh, whoa, right? So I'm always really, really happy when we're reading a Talmudic passage and there's an allusion to a biblical story, and someone says, "Oh, I know that one." But so that's the sort of academic stuff. I would also say that I think the best thing you could do if you're thinking about becoming a rabbi is to go find some rabbis out there, rabbis you know, rabbis you can get to know, and say, how did you decide to become a rabbi? What about the rabbinate surprised you? What do you love best about being a rabbi? And yes, what do you find most challenging about being a rabbi? I promise this never changes anyone's mind about going to rabbinical school. Even if someone says, "Oh my God, it's been terrible," you'll just say, "This is, oh well, it'll be different for me." But I think the rabbinate is, first of all, there are lots of different ways to be a rabbi, and you might learn some things, and also to understand that that the rabbinate is like all other choices, life choices. It's complicated, right? That when I was growing up, I remember my rabbi being this he felt to me like he was 10 feet tall, which was partly because he was very tall and he was also very thin, and he also wore a black robe. So he looked gigantic to me, and I associated him with sitting still, that is, with my sitting still, and with stories, because they didn't take kids to regular services in those days in my synagogue, but he came on the high holidays. They had a children's service, and he told a story every year. I had no idea what rabbis did the rest of the year or the rest of the day. And I have learned since then that rabbis do things I now do things I never imagined I would do. I also discovered I was good at things that I never thought I'd be good at. I'm bad at things that I probably should have known I would be bad at. So just, think of this as an adventure, and think about preparing it the way you might prepare for any adventure. And if you have questions, ask them, right? The Office of Recruitment and Admissions at HUC are the nicest group of people I know. And they want to be there for you through this process. They want to help you. They want you to come to an interview not nervous. I know that's impossible. I want to be able to be helpful to you if you have questions. So please don't hesitate to ask us. And the other thing I would say is that if you're not involved in any aspect of Jewish communal leadership, whether that's, no matter how minor that seems, try it out. Because we're really looking for people not just who want to learn about Judaism, but who want to be leaders. And you want to see how you feel in that space. And there's no one way to lead. I know introverts who lead very well. I know extroverts who don't lead as well. But you do want to get comfortable with that, and try telling a couple people that you're thinking of becoming a rabbi and see how it feels when they look like you've lost your mind. Or, my favorite is when they ask you if, like when your non-Jewish friends ask you if that means you won't be able to get married.
Dvora, in the chat, Alex asked a really good question. I wonder if you can address it.
Oh, yes. Okay, let me read it. Oh, it's long. It's interesting. I heard two high holiday sermons about Israel, and this was before all hell broke loose, right? So they were both about how do we respond as American Jews to the judicial reform and all of these things that are happening. They were both by rabbis who were fairly liberal, broadly speaking, progressive. And one of them was much more tempered, Alex, than the other. And someone said to me, "Oh, I was really disappointed in Sermon A. It didn't go far enough." And I said, here's the thing about being a rabbi or about being a leader is a good leader knows where their community sits. And they know that you can be a certain number of steps ahead of your community. And then you sort of try to either gently shove them from behind or gently pull them from in front, depends. If you get too far in front of your community and push them too hard all at once, they stop listening. And when that happens, then you may still have a job, but you're not leading anymore because they've turned you off, right? Let me tell you a story. During the pandemic, I had a class of students that had to leave Israel early because of the pandemic, and then they were stuck in their apartments, in their parents' houses. They were clearly super stressed out. I got the sense that my gender non-binary students were especially stressed out, probably because they were living with their parents and all those pictures up on the wall that weren't them anymore. And let's just say they were not behaving quite the way the faculty hoped they would. And someone said to me, "Dvora, you should really tell these students that they're not behaving well." And I said, look, I have met these people for 5 days. I was in Israel with them right before COVID. I said, I don't have a relationship of trust with them yet. And if I get on Zoom and start to tell people who barely know me and don't know how much I care about them, that I'm really disappointed in them, they're going to turn off Zoom and never listen to me again. And so that's not what I'm going to do. And that, I think, is partly about leadership, is that you need to know where your community is and where you might be able to get them. And that never means that you should compromise your principles. Compromising your principles is when you get up and you tell them something you don't believe at all, right? That's compromising your principles. I would never want you to do that. But you have to decide, are you on a crusade or are you trying to get people to move somewhat? I think one of my colleagues once objected to a speaker I brought in to talk to the students because he thought the person was too moderate. And he said to me, you know, Dvora, what about our prophetic tradition? What about the prophets who, if you've ever read them, you know, gave the people what for? And I said to him, Rabbi, not a single one of the prophets was successful in leadership, right? And if you read the prophets, I think you'll see that I'm right. You know, they make great reading on Shabbat morning. But I said, and so sometimes I want to scream at people. Often I want to scream at people. And yet my experience teaches me that that's not the best way to move people. As somebody who came of age at JTS when we were trying to convince them to ordain women and wanted to scream every day, I discovered that there are better ways to win than screaming. So there will be moments where you will scream, Alex, and I will support you in those moments. But you need to make sure they're the moments where you really have no choice but screaming, because otherwise you won't get anywhere. So this is about what I would call honest, principled, strategic leadership. It's not always satisfying. Sometimes we desperately want to scream. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn together. I hope I'll get a chance to talk to you and to meet you all in person somewhere down the line. And again, please, you can find me at D. Weisberg at huc.edu. And if you forget that, you can find me on the HUC website. And I'm happy to do anything I can to help you through this process. And Alex, I hope you feel better. And good luck.